Hi there. This is a presentation that I gave in November 2023 at the British Antarctic Survey Centre in Cambridge in the UK, at a meeting for their PhD students. And I was kind of the lunchtime entertainment, as it were, to just really to freshen up their conference after sort of lots of concentrating through scientific talks. Anyway, I thought I'd record the audio of my presentation because it was a presentation that I was probably never going to give again. If you're interested, you can watch that presentation following on from this. It's obviously aimed at science PhD students, but explaining why I felt that going through a science PhD has actually really benefited my career as an underwater photographer. And my brief was also to show them some pretty pictures, so the talk starts with that. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, thanks for the chance to come and speak to you. As Natalie said in that introduction, I work as an underwater photographer, which I know is an unusual job, so I'll spend a little bit of my talk telling you kind of how that really works. But I also want to go on, and I promise you I'm going to show you lots of nice, pretty pictures, not ones of me, thankfully, pictures I've taken. I want to go on and talk a little bit about how I think the person that I became, the skills that I developed, away from the actual nuts and bolts of the science, doing a PhD in science, have helped me through my career as a photographer. And I think this is an interesting to talk about because some of you, I'm sure, will stay in science. 25 years ago, when I was sitting in rooms like this with other PhD students, I would have said, I'm definitely going to stay in science. But I've transitioned to the world of arts, and actually I hope to give you some encouragement for the future that if the career does take a different turn, that you may be not using the microscope skills or the lab skills, but actually so many of the things you develop as a person during your PhD remain valuable. I feel that the rhythm of my job has quite a bit in common with working as a scientist. I go to the field, I want to make the most of that time in the field, and then I come back from the field and I have to process what I've created in the field and get that out there. And I think that's something that really comes from science. There's no point discovering things as a scientist without sharing that knowledge through publication, and it's the same thing for me as a photographer. If I create images, I don't want to just create them for myself, I want to get them out there into the public's domain. I'd also say that, for me, getting the most out of those opportunities is really important. In the same way that when you do your science, you want to get the best possible data you can, given the opportunities that you've got, because that data is going to have the strongest impact in your field. And it's exactly the same with photography. When I choose to work on a species, work on a destination, I want to create really powerful images because those powerful images will reach out and grab people's attention and make them pay attention to the stories and the issues that I'm interested in. I am drawn to the underwater world as a photographer because it's just a wonderful place to take images. There's a richness of life, of bizarre life underwater. Creatures come in every sort of shape and size. The environments that I get to explore, I think, are fascinating, beautiful, varied, and can be incredibly rich with life. And these are wonderful things to bring to the public. Many of my peers are wildlife photographers on land, and they always sort of say to me, well, you're the weirdo who goes underwater, and I always feel that, they've very much got the short end of the wedge, certainly in terms of the variety that we have underwater. The subjects that I get to work with are incredibly varied. This is a tiny shrimp that's about the size of the lead that sticks out the end of a pencil. It's called a hairy shrimp, rather unsurprisingly. And it's absolutely minute. But I get to work across a whole range of scales, all the way up to, this is a blue whale here in the Indian Ocean. The creatures that I get to work with are very diverse, and that makes it constantly enthralling. This is a mimic octopus. It's a type of long-armed benthic octopus that enjoys an unusual lifestyle out on the open sand, keeping itself safe. And the stories we get to tell about those creatures as photographers are varied. This is it in its larval stage, when it's part of the plankton still. And I think that's something that is a great attraction to me in this area, that there's so many stories to tell. There's so much that people like you are still sorting out about the natural world and the underwater world, and the fact that as a photographer, you get to tell those stories. I enjoy the fact that I can tell stories across a whole range of trophic levels. This is a golden jellyfish. And these are one of those jellyfish that live in landlocked marine lakes where there aren't any predators. And so these jellyfish lose their sting and instead, have endosymbiotic algae inside their bodies that allow them to feed. And they basically spend their day sunbathing. The lake is surrounded by big hills, and so the sun doesn't land on all the lake all the time. So the jellyfish just swim around the lake, staying in the sun all day to feed the algae. But you get to tell stories from there right up to the top end of the trophic levels in the ocean. This is a male orca up in the Arctic. And I think that's something, but I try to find fascination, for me as a photographer, at both those levels of the chain. In fact, I think some of the most interesting photography is when you're dealing with some of the less exciting species. And I think it's something perhaps the science and within science communication is really important. Finding ways to present the maybe less charismatic species in interesting ways. I do that visually, but as scientists you maybe do that more verbally to tell their stories, because they can be incredibly important. Sometimes, of course, there's gifts come from them. This is a tiny sea slug. They are really small, these guys. They just, I'm trying to think something that's about this. I don't see anything small, but they're kind of, if you draw a circle on a piece of paper, as small as you can, you can still see the hole in the middle of the circle. That's how big these costiellas are. But when you get down to their level, incredibly cute little creatures. I think something else that I find endlessly interesting in underwater photography is that there's so much frontier to explore. This is a species of Nembrotho nudibranch that's not described by science. And that's very common, really, in the big scheme of things to encounter as an underwater photographer. And that's not because we're pushing boundaries back. It's simply really a reflection of the lack of funding, particularly in tropical marine science, that there's just stuff out there. And as photographers, we're often, the first to see and document species. And it's not just at that sort of invertebrate level. This is a shark species. Of a type of epaulet shark. And when I took this picture 10 years ago or so, this species still hadn't been named. And it's a weird species of epaulet shark. They call them walking sharks because they prefer not to swim, and they walk on their pectoral and pelvic fins across the seabed to look for food, and they have very narrow distributions because of that. One of the reasons why there's diversity. Many common subjects that underwater photographers enjoy to shoot. These are pygmy seahorses, about 1 centimetre high, not completely tiny, but not very big. And these were only described in 2008, but underwater photographers, we've been photographing them for much longer than that. Another species, this is a goby, we call it a unicorn goby. This was only described in 2019. And this doesn't live in some weird tiny island in the middle of Indonesia or something that hardly anyone's been to. You can see these at sort of waist-deep water in the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is surrounded by, it's probably one of the most studied tropical areas of the ocean. And yet there was a species sort of hiding there in plain sight that no one had bothered to look at. I love the fact that my photography takes me beyond, sort of what people often think of as normal marine creatures, and it reminds people that there's real diversity in the groups that are down there. There are reptiles. This is a hawksbill turtle, which has been busy feeding on these red soft corals behind him. And a mixture of different reptiles. This is obviously a sea snake. One of my favourite marine reptiles is the iguanas from Galapagos that have obviously evolved to dive underwater and feed on the benthic algae since the islands are so desiccated. And even in freshwater, we can run into some interesting reptiles. This is a freshwater cooter in Florida. I enjoy the fact that you can surprise people with subject matter as an underwater photographer. So maybe people don't expect me to do a lot of bird photography, but underwater there are opportunities to shoot birds and tell their stories. This is a cormorant, a Brandt's cormorant, feeding on or hunting these chub mackerel underneath an oil rig, actually, off Los Angeles. And very, very fast, very impressive birds in the water. I actually watched one of these on this dive. I can't get too sidetracked, but actually a sea lion, which are very fast in the water, was chasing some fish. And the cormorant actually overtook the sea lion and took the fish that it was chasing. So they're very, very quick in the water. And those that work with penguins don't need to be told these things, of course. Marine mammals, always fascinating to spend time with and to photograph. This is a common seal, common seal or harbour seal in California. And a little further south down in Mexico, this is a sea lion pup. Perhaps the most adorable thing you can do underwater is to watch these. And I'm going to watch myself and watch the clock before I talk too much. These sea lion pups, they develop their hunting skills by picking up objects up from the seabed. They take them to the surface of the water, drop them, let the object get a head start, and then chase after them. And this guy picked up this very pretty Panamic starfish, took it up to the surface, and I watched it a few times, saw how long it took for it to catch up to the starfish, and then I waited at that depth so that I could get a photo just as he caught up to the starfish. Other marine mammals, these are manatees, mainly resting with a bit of digestion going on there as well. A lot of plants to be eaten by manatees, and this is a dugong in the Red Sea. Much more athletic than the manatees, the dugong. It's very fast. Actually very hard, probably strangely one of the hardest work subjects. This was probably the least taxing photo here to take. I was just floating and they weren't going anywhere. And this was one of the hardest photos to take because the dugong feeds on the bottom, goes up to the surface to swim, swims along while it's breathing and then dives back down again, and you have to try and swim with it while it's on the surface to keep it in sight. Dolphins are obviously far too fast to try and keep up with, but they do have a curiosity to come back, and this is perhaps my most enjoyable dolphin encounter. You might have spotted that one of the marine mammals in this picture isn't a dolphin. It's a golden retriever. And this is a golden retriever called Antar. I didn't set this shot up. And Antar lives on a sailing boat in the Red Sea, and we were photographing dolphins, and suddenly Antar appeared. And we discovered later, talking to the owners of the dog, that he lives on this boat and he loves dolphins. And as soon as he sees dolphins, he starts barking. And as soon as the boat gets close to the dolphins, he runs down to the back deck and jumps in the water on his own and swims off. And for them, it's a real pain to get him back. They have to go out of the little dinghy and haul him back out of the water. And he loves swimming around the dolphins. And so that's always been a very memorable encounter for me. You can't be an underwater photographer without pointing your camera towards fish from time to time. And I love fish photography, particularly the diversity in the types of fish. It's always fun to surprise people by the different types of fish that you get to photograph as a photographer. The numbers that they can gather in, the colours and density that they pull together. And then aspects of their life, the way they feed, the way they hunt, the way they get cleaned or clean others. This is a large Pacific manta ray being cleaned. It's an oceanic manta. These angelfish that are cleaning it are about this long. They don't look very big in this photo, but this is a sort of a great big scene. And the angelfish swim out from the reef in the Pacific Islands of Mexico to clean the mantas. And of course, how they spawn the next generation. Finally, as a photographer, I think what draws me in is a love of the visuals of the underwater world, the beauty of light in the water, just as a purely artistic experience is something that keeps me going underwater. And the way you can use light as a photographer, using the technology, the creativity that you have through a camera to create images that are a little bit, go beyond standard record shots and begin to have create emotion and bring impression from the underwater world. It's something that I really enjoy because I think the more visually stunning my work is, the more people are likely to engage with it, and that's obviously a great value if I want people to tell stories about that part of the ocean. Now, as Natalie said in the introduction, 25 years ago I was a Ph.D. student like you guys, sitting in rooms like this, and I have very much left that world behind. But you can, take the person out of the PhD, but you can't really take the PhD out of the person. And it remains part of who I am and what I do. And as it will with all of you, as you go on through your careers, whether they remain purely academic or in other areas. I don't do any research anymore. I do occasionally get roped into things. And these are a couple of recent papers. Generally, when I'm asked to be on a paper, I always just say, just put me in the acknowledgements, because it's of no real value to me as a photographer anymore. But this is the most recent one. Natalie asked me to talk about briefly how come I got on a coral spawning and sea star paper. And actually Liv, who's the first author on this, and she actually observed this behaviour. And in her research, when wanting to write the paper, realised that I'd actually, as a photographer, observed exactly the same behaviour sort of, I think, 10 years or so before she did. And so she wrote to me and we began collaborating on this paper and exchanging notes. And it's just a short paper on that behaviour. But that's the only science I do now, and I try and keep it a pretty wide berth. But as I said, it remains a big part of me. Just about every article or interview that I've ever done, someone always points out that obviously having a marine science background is quite valuable as an underwater photographer. And of course I would never dispute that. In fact, a lot of my friends and colleagues who are wildlife photographers generally, many of them have science backgrounds, whether it's undergraduate level or postgraduate level. It's actually very common in our field that many of the leading photographers have those backgrounds. Far more common than any of them having artistic or photographic backgrounds, strangely. And clearly it informs certain types of pictures. This is the photo of coral spawning that I took in the Cayman Islands. And this is a picture that definitely, played on that scientific background. No one had seen coral spawning in the Cayman Islands, mass coral spawning in the Cayman Islands. And some friends of mine who were there asked me to have a look at it. And simply as a result of a literature search, I figured out some timings that would allow them to see the mass spawning and then travelled there to photograph it. And actually that was 20 years ago, and for every year for the 20 years, those timings have remained completely accurate. But they allowed me to produce this shot and to do that story. So the science definitely influences those things in terms of allowing you to get shots or realise images that other people wouldn't. But I would say more than that, it drives you in terms of where your interests lie. As a photographer, you make choices all the time. I get to decide where I focus, how I compose, how I light, the settings I'll use, the subject I choose to photograph. All of those are decisions that come from me. And those decisions come from who you are as a person, your influences. So the person that you are influences very much not just the style of images you create, but what you choose to photograph. And this was a project of mine photographing the hamlet fish, which are a fascinating species. And I can't go on too long about them, so I know I'm a bit pushed for time. But they are one of the most bizarre groups of marine fish around, and no one had paid them any attention in the natural history world at all before that. And the reason they're interesting, just very briefly, is first of all, they're one of the few, many fish change sex during their lives, but hamlets are one of the few vertebrate species that remain fully active as male and females. So they're fully hermaphrodite and fully sexually active as both male and female through their whole adult life. And the way they spawn, which is what's going on here, is actually dictated to that. They actually change sexual roles during the spawning. So both fish, when they spawn each way. The other really unusual thing about hamlets is that the group of hamlets, there are lots of different types of hamlets, and they're all different colours. And you can tell them apart instantly when you're underwater. But when they look at them in terms of their genetic makeup, what they find is that two hamlets of the same colour on the same reef will actually be genetically more different than two hamlets of completely different colours on opposite sides of the whole Caribbean basin where this fish come from. So they're a really fascinating group, and there's a lot of genetic research into them, trying to really unpick them. And the kind of conclusion of all that is that they're basically just too recently evolved, or too recently differentiated, speciated into these different types. And no one's really sure whether they will end up really properly differentiating. And I think that makes them really fascinating as a group of fish. And I've interacted a lot with the different scientists, mainly providing them just imagery to help illustrate and promote the science they're doing. but also talking to them about the observations I have, particularly the underwater observations, because the hamlets do also hybridize, and how often you see hybrid spawning is of interest to what's driving that speciation. So, for me, the subjects that I'm drawn to often come from that science background, and that, I think, has helped mark me out in my career from my peers. Another group of fish that I've always been fascinated by are that big gang in the back of this picture, which are boa snappers, which gather to spawn in one of the most spectacular places you could go diving, which is the Ras Mohammed National Park at the tip of Sinai in Egypt. And these are big fish. Each of these are large, very long-lived predatory fish. They can live up to about 80 years old, which is old for a tropical fish. They obviously have much faster metabolism than Paddy's fish he was showing us from down south. They live for a long time, and they're usually solitary hunters, but they gather for spawning once a year. And these spawning aggregations in Egypt have always attracted me to want to go and photograph them. And they spawn in these big, dramatic spawning events where a gang of males will follow a female or two females and release these massive trails of sperm as they spawn. The problem with fish gathering to spawn, when the whole population from a large area gathers in one place, is they become easily exploited. And that can be very devastating when you wipe out a whole adult population of long-lived fish because they happen to gather to spawn and need to gather to spawn. And, one of the nice things about being a photographer and producing really eye-catching work of these particular species is the whole conservation situation in Egypt has changed now because of me creating strong images, sharing those images with friends and colleagues, particularly in Egypt, and really promoting this as a positive thing for Egypt. And what the government in Egypt now do, to cut a long story short, is they now pay the fishermen to stay in port during those important spawning months, the local fishermen. So there's no longer this big fleet. There was about 20 boats this particular evening all going out to fish them. And as a result of the imagery, that really sort of gives those opportunities. I think the other thing that came from that science background is that realization that going out into the field, collecting data, in my case pictures, isn't the end of the story. The story is actually turning that raw material of research, of time in the field, of data, into the finished article. And so for me, it's always been a really important part of my career to make sure that I was publishing what I was creating. And I obviously have published lots and lots and lots of articles. I think about 1,000 articles over the last 20 years or so on marine life, on underwater photography, in all sorts of mainstream magazines. And the advantage of writing for mainstream magazines is you can write the work a lot quicker than you can write an academic paper, and they pay you for it as well, which is also quite appealing. My pictures get very widely used in all sorts of places, and I also sell my photos through both myself but also through stock agencies. And this is how photographers work: is pictures have to come from somewhere, and someone has to pay for the rights to use them. So whether that's with all sorts of places see my pictures. These are just a random few. And generally, I would say as a photographer, I'm selling the rights for licensed use of my pictures probably 3 or 4 times each day over the course of a year. Usually happens is someone comes and buys 20 and then you don't sell any more that week. But it kind of averages out at about that sort of number. Going to all sorts of weird and wonderful and different places where photos end up, used, just about everywhere in life, used to promote brands, both, within sort of a field that feels normal to ones from very different walks of life. I also write a little bit. I'm not a big fan of writing. I much prefer taking pictures. But I do write books or collaborate on books with friends and colleagues who maybe do the hard work of the writing. I think that comes from that desire as a scientist that it is really no point in collecting experiences, observations of the wider world without sharing it. And so I've always been very keen, whether it's to share techniques of underwater photography or stories and information about marine life. The final example I was going to talk about is really how, however much you try and escape being a scientist, it never really leaves you. And it means that you have a sort of a diligence, a thoroughness to anything that you want to take on as a project. And I thought this was quite a good example to talk about, because it's completely away from marine biology, completely away from natural history, from wildlife. And it was a wreck project. And there's an amazing shipwreck also in Egypt, actually, called the Thistlegorm. The Thistlegorm was a military transport ship during the Second World War that was on anchor waiting for permission to proceed to unload this cargo, and was bombed and sank in the Red Sea. And it's a very popular dive site. We calculated once that well over probably 1 million dives have been made by recreational scuba divers. And I'd be very surprised if there aren't people in this room who've dived on it. And it was one of the most well-known shipwrecks, for many, many people. It remains one of the most well-known shipwrecks in the year. And the reason I fell into this project is I started taking pictures there. And I wanted to know what were in the photo, what the subjects were that I was photographing. And what makes the Thistlegorm really unique is she was loaded particularly with military vehicles. And there's almost 200 military vehicles on the Thistlegorm in the wreck. About 70, 80 of those are trucks and lorries. And there's about 110 motorbikes on the wreck. I took pictures of them and I wanted to know what these were. And if I looked in books and articles about the Thistlegorm, people had said what they were. But when I tried to dive deeper and actually see what people told me, that people used to say this was a Bedford truck. And then I looked at all the Bedford trucks in the Second World War, and none looked like this. And that was something of a rabbit hole that I got dragged down into. But I think that came very much from that scientific background of really not just because someone says it, you really want to prove it to yourself. And what I learned is by photographing all these different vehicles on the wreck, I had a fantastic photographic record on my laptop, and I started visiting military vehicle festivals, where people who own these vehicles to this day and restore them, I could actually go and show them my pictures. And they were used to seeing these vehicles in sort of half-dismantled state, and could recognise by the fact that this has got, front forks in this orientation and things like that, exactly what they were. And that allowed us to finally identify all the vehicles on the wreck and completely change the perception of what that wreck was. And it now seems very clear that a large proportion of that hardware, which was always considered for the army, was actually probably much more Air Force focused. And it's really changed the story of the wreck. Related to that, and with a couple of colleagues, we also did a photogrammetry survey of the wreck. And that's where you go down and rather than taking one photo, you take thousands of photos. And the guys did most of the work, I just did a small part of it, actually ended up taking 24,000 photos of the wreck, put them all into a massive long computer program, waited about a week and a half, and out the other end came a 3D model of the wreck. And I can probably spin it around for you here. Of the wreck, and we mapped it both inside and out, and that allowed us to really accurately map the entire layout of the ship and finally be able to do really accurate maps of it, because sometimes when you swim inside the wreck it's all silty, you can't see this far. So it really opened up that space to us, and became a real milestone project in marine archaeology. And in fact one of our team is John Henderson, is an archaeologist, and he's written up lots of our work. But we've also produced a book as well about this wreck as a result of that project. And I would say all of that came, I have no interest in marine archaeology at all, but all of that came really from that scientific background of not simply wanting to accept what someone told me, but really wanting to understand what was on this wreck. And that led to us diving into that wider world. Right, the final point I want to finish on, and I know I'm very close on time, is to talk a little bit about career development as a scientist and as a photographer. And it's something I learned from science, is that as a scientist, your brand, and I know that's not a word that scientists ever want to hear, your brand is your name. And how you look after that name will no doubt influence your career opportunities through your, as you progress. If people have strong opinions of you, your work, then you will have, great opportunities. And that's something that's very true as a photographer. And the analogy I like to use is the wall or the castle built of bricks that's constantly being eroded a little bit. And each thing that you do, each, great presentation you give, each abstract you submit, each paper that you write, that's a brick. Just a big paper is a big brick, and another abstract. And the more of these bricks you build, the bigger your reputation comes. So for me as a photographer, there's a constant need to be doing high-profile articles, doing interviews. We don't have papers, but we have competitions in underwater photography or in wildlife photography. And so you want to be awarded in the big competitions. I always say that the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, which is a big natural history competition run by the Natural History Museum in London, that's kind of our biggest event. It's something a bit like kind of a nature paper in science, 40 or 50 or 50 or 60 photographers each year get awarded in that. And that's a massive feather in your cap as a photographer. But for me, it's just another big brick in that wall. And that wall is always crumbling down because the world doesn't remember what you did 5-10 years ago. As a photographer and as a scientist, they probably don't care too much what you did 10-15 years ago. And so for me, it's always important to be investing in that wall. There's not going to be ever one big thing that changes everyone's opinion of you. But if you're constantly working hard, having outputs, building that wall, I think that helps your reputation and definitely opens your doors. So this is my final slide. And just to finish, I would say that, 25 years ago, I'd have been sitting in this audience going, I'm going to stay in science and I'm going to do all these things. And as a scientist. And what I've ended up doing is transitioning from science into the arts. Yet I've found that so much of what I learned during my PhD has informed who I am, has informed what I shoot, and has definitely helped me have a successful career in such an unusual type of job. And so I encourage you all to enjoy your science, but remember that you're not only learning about diatoms in coral or how much a fish can gape, you're also building skills that are going to serve you well through the rest of your lives. So thank you very much for having me to talk.